A blind, freezing old man begs for pennies in dive bars with a cheap guitar. To the street, he is just another starving vagrant. But here is the sickening paradox. That helpless beggar is Sam Langford, ranked a top 10 fighter in human history, a machine who terrified heavyweight kings. So how does a boxing legend end up rotting in absolute darkness? He wasn't beaten by a better man. He was destroyed by the system, blocked by the racist color line, backstabbed by his own peer, Jack Johnson, and exploited by greedy promoters. This is the dark reality of professional boxing. They use you until you are broken and throw you away when the money stops. Sam Langford was born on March 4th, 1886, in Weymouth Falls, Nova Scotia. His grandfather was a slave. His family lived in severe poverty, but the primary threat to his survival was his father. His father beat him continuously. From early childhood, Langford absorbed heavy, blunt force trauma. When a human body is subjected to repeated physical trauma, the nervous system adapts. The pain receptors deaden. Langford learned how to brace for impact. In 1901, at 15 years old, Langford reached his limit. He packed nothing and left home. He had no money and no destination. He just knew he had to get out of striking range. He walked out of Weymouth Falls and headed toward the logging camps in rural Nova Scotia to find work. The logging camps were built for raw manual labor. Langford was a malnourished 15-year-old placed in a high-risk industrial environment. He worked 12 to 14 hours a day. His job consisted of swinging heavy axes, pulling two-man crosscut saws, and dragging raw timber through freezing mud. He performed this work while severely underfed. This extreme labor altered his physical development. The human skeleton and muscular system adapt to the demands placed upon them. Because of the heavy lifting and malnutrition, Langford's vertical growth stopped early. He maxed out at 5 feet 7 inches, but his upper body, kept expanding to handle the workload. Swinging an axe thousands of times a day built massive torque in his core and back. Dragging logs built dense shoulder muscles and abnormal grip strength. His anatomy became deformed in a highly specific way. He developed a thick, barrel-shaped chest. His arms grew unusually long, resulting in a 74-inch reach. He had the short legs and low center of gravity of a lightweight, but the upper body mass, shoulder width, and leverage of a heavyweight. His long arms functioned like levers attached to a dense, compact base. It was a physical structure uniquely built to generate maximum kinetic force. Langford realized the logging camps would eventually break his body for pennies. He quit and walked south, crossing the border and heading toward Boston, Massachusetts. He arrived in Boston with nothing. He slept on the streets and looked for day labor. He eventually found an indoor job at the Lenox Athletic Club. The Lenox was a local boxing gym. Men came there to spar, train, and fight for small purses. The management hired Langford as a janitor. His job was simple. He cleaned up after the fighters. He swept the floors. He wiped the spittoons. He took a mop and scrubbed the dried blood and sweat off the canvas ring. He was invisible to the fighters and the promoters. But Langford watched them. He saw men stepping into a ring and getting paid to inflict and absorb physical damage. He realized they were making money doing exactly what his father had done to him for free. He watched their mechanics. He studied how they planted their feet and rotated their hips to throw a punch. At night, after the gym closed and everyone went home, Langford stayed. The lights were out. He put down his mop, walked over to the heavy canvas bags hanging from the ceiling, and started hitting them. He had no trainer. He did not know the technical rules of boxing. He just applied the mechanics he learned in the logging camps to the heavy bag, planted his short legs, twisted his wide torso, and snapped his unusually long arms forward. The physical impact was massive. Because of his low center of gravity and his 74-inch reach, he generated the concussive force of a man 30 pounds heavier. He hit the bag in the dark night after night. He was a runaway teenager with a deformed upper body, a deadened nervous system, and a punch that could drop a heavyweight. He was just a janitor trying to survive. He had no idea the local promoters were about to walk in and turn him into a machine. The boxing industry in Boston in 1902 was not a regulated sport. It was an illicit economy. In many parts of the United States, professional prize fighting was technically illegal. To bypass the law, promoters operated under the guise of private athletic clubs. These clubs were controlled by a tight network of local politicians, corrupt police captains, and illegal gambling syndicates. The gate receipts from ticket sales were just the front operation. The real money was made in the heavy, unregulated trackside betting. The men who ran this system did not care about athletic competition. They needed predictable outcomes to protect their betting lines. The fighters in the ring were simply the dice. The management at the Lenox Athletic Club eventually noticed their janitor hitting the heavy bags after hours. They did not see a young prodigy. They saw an exploitable variable. They ran a cold clinical assessment of the asset. Sam Langford was 16 years old. He possessed the punching power of a heavyweight, but he only weighed 140 pounds. He could be matched against men of almost any size. More importantly, he was black, homeless, and completely illiterate. He had no family to ask questions. He had no legal representation to demand audits. He was the ultimate low-risk, high-yield commodity. The promoters immediately pulled him off the janitorial staff and offered him a professional contract. Langford could not read the document placed in front of him. He did not understand the legal mechanics of managerial percentages, promotional cuts, or liability waivers. He simply saw a piece of paper that promised him a few dollars to do what he was already doing for free. He signed it. With that signature, a 16-year-old boy surrendered total legal autonomy over his own body. The standard boxing contract in 1902 was an instrument of financial extraction. A manager typically took an initial 33% of the fighter's purse. But the extraction did not stop there. The syndicate deducted operational expenses directly from the fighter's remaining share. They charged Langford for his own training equipment. They charged him for his sparring partners. They charged him for travel and medical supplies. By the time the math was finished, the men sitting ringside smoking cigars kept the vast majority of the capital. The teenager taking concussions to the skull walked away with pennies. The syndicate wasted no time testing their new asset. They threw Langford straight into the professional meat grinder. In 1902, there were no athletic commissions protecting minors. There were no strict weigh-ins. The promoters used Langford as a wild card to disrupt local betting odds. They matched him against grown men, seasoned professionals, and heavier fighters. They did not care about his physical development or long-term health. The business model was based on rapid depreciation. You fight an asset as often as possible, extract the cash, and discard it when the body breaks. But Langford did not break. The trauma conditioning of his childhood and the warped, dense musculature built in the logging camps held up. He battered the local fighters. His abnormal 74-inch reach allowed him to strike from outside his opponent's range, while his massive chest and core generated devastating blunt force. He won constantly. He won so often that he became a problem for the local bookmakers. He was destroying their predictable betting lines. The Syndicate realized they possessed a highly lethal weapon. They decided to aim it directly at the top of the industry to generate massive gate revenue. By late 1903, Langford was 17 years old. The promoters orchestrated a bout with Joe Gans. Gans was the reigning world lightweight champion. He was a master tactician and a highly valuable property for the boxing establishment. The fight took place on December 8, 1903, in Boston. The Syndicate aggressively marketed the bout. The betting pools swelled. Langford was supposed to be a stepping stone, a tough local kid brought in to make the champion look good and drive up the gambling handle. The fight was scheduled for 15 rounds. It was a physical execution, but not the one the Syndicate planned. Langford stalked the champion. He absorbed Gans's precise strikes without flinching. He walked straight through the champion's defense and delivered heavy structural damage. For 15 rounds, Langford dominated the lightweight king. He battered Gans across the ring. The crowd watched a 17-year-old dismantle an established champion. Ringside, the promoters panicked. If Joe Gans lost his title to an unmanaged independent teenager, the Syndicate lost control of the lightweight championship. They lost their leverage. They lost future revenue streams. They immediately intervened. The promoters colluded with the athletic club officials and the press. Before the final bell rang, the terms of reality were simply rewritten. They declared the fight a non-title bout. Langford was awarded the decision, but the belt stayed with Gans. Langford did the physical labor. He inflicted the damage, but the Syndicate manipulated the paperwork. The championship remained secure in the hands of the establishment. 10 months later, the Syndicate repeated the exact same protocol. On September 5th, 1904, they booked 18-year-old Langford against Barbados' Joe Walcott. Walcott was the reigning LD welterweight champion. He was a brutally strong, compact fighter known as the Barbados Demon. The fight took place in Manchester, New Hampshire. It was scheduled for 15 rounds. Once again, Langford systematically broke down a sitting world champion. In the second round, Langford opened a severe cut on Walcott. Blood spilled onto the canvas. In the third round, Langford landed a strike that dropped the champion to his knees. Walcott was physically outmatched. He spent the remainder of the fight trying to survive the teenager's power. Langford's defense was impenetrable. He took virtually no damage. When the final bell rang, the outcome was mathematically obvious to everyone in the building. The referee stepped to the center of the ring. Referees in this era were not neutral arbiters. They were employees of the athletic clubs, chosen and paid by the promoters. The referee looked at a bleeding, battered Walcott. He looked at an untouched Langford. Then he raised both of their hands. He declared the fight a draw. The crowd erupted in anger. The press immediately called it a robbery. But the outrage did not matter. The official record was locked. A draw meant the title could not change hands. Walcott kept the belt. The promoters protected their property. The betting lines were settled in favor of the house. For Sam Langford, the Walcott fight was the definitive education. The reality of his profession crystallized. He learned that the boxing industry was not a meritocracy. It was a rigged financial apparatus. He realized that it did not matter how hard he trained. It did not matter how much damage he inflicted. It did not matter if he made the champion bleed or forced him to his knees. His fists could knock a man unconscious, but they could not punch through a corrupt contract. They could not knock out a referee on the Syndicate payroll. Langford was an 18-year-old kid trapped in a closed system. He was a machine built to generate profit, but he was explicit. Banned from owning the results of his own labor. The meat grinder had locked him in, and it was only going to speed up. The boxing syndicate operated on a single governing principle. Weight classes were an illusion designed to sell tickets, easily discarded when gambling revenue dictated otherwise. By April 1906, 20-year-old Sam Langford had become a logistical problem for the Boston promoters. He was physically a middleweight, weighing exactly 156 pounds, but his abnormal wingspan and concussive power made him lethal to anyone his own size. The local betting lines dried up because nobody would bet against him in a fair fight. The promoters realized they had to change the variables. To stimulate the gambling market, they needed to place Langford in a scenario where his death or severe injury was the mathematically probable outcome. They looked up the ranks to the heavyweight division, the apex of boxing's capitalist food chain. They found Jack Johnson. Jack Johnson was not yet the world heavyweight champion, but he was already recognized as the most dangerous black heavyweight on the planet. He was a massive, highly intelligent operator who understood the brutal mechanics of the fight game better than the men who ran it. He stood over 6 feet tall and stepped on the scale at 185 pounds of solid muscle. He was a defensive genius who used his sheer mass to exhaust opponents, tying them up, leaning on them, and breaking their posture before dismantling them with heavy counter-strikes. When the promoters drafted the contract for Langford to fight Johnson in Chelsea, Massachusetts, they were not arranging a sporting event. They were setting up a 29-pound weight discrepancy. In the raw physics of professional fighting, a 30-pound disadvantage against an elite heavyweight is a sanctioned execution. The Syndicate expected the giant to erase the anomaly. The fight took place on April 26, 1906. The bell rang inside the Chelsea Armory, and the physical reality of the size difference immediately dictated the terms of survival. Johnson executed his standard blueprint. He used his height and superior leverage to press down on Langford, forcing the smaller man to carry his 185-pound frame. He threw heavy, calculated strikes designed to snap the 20-year-old's neck. For the first few rounds, it looked exactly like the massacre the bookmakers had financed. But the Syndicate had failed to account for the neurological modifications forged in the Weymouth Falls logging camps. Langford did not break. He absorbed the heavy artillery. He bit down, tightened his massive barrel-shaped chest, and kept walking forward into the larger man's range. Midway through the 15-round bout, the mathematics of the fight suddenly inverted. Johnson left a microscopic opening in his defense. Langford stepped inside the giant's reach, planted his feet, and fired a hook powered by his freakish 74-inch wingspan. The impact landed flush on Johnson's jaw. The 185-pound heavyweight dropped to one knee. The crowd inside the Chelsea Armory went dead silent. The impossible had just happened. A 156-pound kid had structurally compromised the most feared heavyweight contender in the country. Johnson immediately recognized the severe threat to his consciousness and his career. He scrambled to his feet, abandoning his offensive strategy. For the remainder of the fight, the massive heavyweight fought entirely on the defensive, clinching, tying up Langford's arms, and doing everything physically possible to avoid taking another direct hit. When the 15th round ended, Johnson was awarded the decision on points. The Syndicate kept their money, and the official record showed a victory for the heavier man. But the physical damage was secondary to the psychological outcome. Johnson walked out of the Chelsea Armory, knowing the cold truth. He had barely survived a man 30 pounds lighter than him. Langford had planted a seed of absolute terror in the heavyweight's mind. Johnson realized that if Langford ever gained another 10 pounds of muscle, the smaller man would kill him in the ring. It was a risk assessment Johnson would never forget, and it would dictate the financial future of both men for the next decade. 2 years later, in 1908, the global boxing economy shifted permanently. Jack Johnson chased the reigning white world heavyweight champion Tommy Burns all the way to Sydney, Australia. He battered Burns and claimed the world heavyweight title. Johnson became the first black heavyweight champion in history. He had conquered the white establishment. He had broken the ultimate racial barrier in sports. He controlled the most lucrative asset in the athletic world. Back in the United States, Sam Langford watched his former opponent take the throne. Langford had naturally filled out to 165 pounds. He was destroying heavyweights across the country. He was the undisputed number one contender. The logical, highly profitable next step was a rematch for the world title. Instead, Jack Johnson executed the most ruthless, cold-blooded business maneuver of his career. He adopted the exact same white supremacist business model that had oppressed him, and he weaponized it against his own people. The boxing industry operated under an unwritten, highly enforced rule known as the color line. White champions historically refused to defend their titles against black contenders. The justification was rooted in the economics of white supremacy. The Syndicate could not risk a black man holding the belt because it meant losing control of the championship revenue stream and dismantling the myth of white physical dominance. When Johnson won the belt, the black fighting circuit expected him to erase the color line. Instead, Johnson drew it thicker. He publicly announced that he would only defend his heavyweight title against white challengers. He completely banned black fighters from contending for the belt. Specifically, he chose Ned Sam Langford. Johnson's decision was not driven by racial politics. It was driven by pure financial preservation. Fighting white heavyweights, men the press openly labeled great white hopes, generated massive, unprecedented gate revenues. The white public paid exorbitant sums, hoping to see Johnson violently dethroned. Johnson was making a fortune mocking the white establishment in the ring. But behind the scenes, he knew exactly what he was doing. A white heavyweight was a highly profitable, low-risk investment. Sam Langford was a high-risk, fatal liability. Johnson remembered the hook in Chelsea. He knew Langford possessed the mechanical ability to put him to sleep and take his title. Johnson decided he would rather endure the hatred of the white public than face the devastating reality of Langford's fists. For 5 years, Langford hunted the champion. He followed Johnson across the country, issuing public challenges in the press, attempting to corner him into a fight. The boxing syndicates, realizing the massive gambling potential of a Johnson-Langford rematch, finally attempted to force the issue. In 1913, a group of international promoters cornered Johnson in Paris. They offered to back a title fight between the two men. Johnson was trapped. He could not legally refuse the bout without publicly admitting he was terrified of a smaller man. So, he utilized a different tactic: financial extortion. Johnson agreed to the fight, but he inserted a poison pill into the contract. He demanded a $30,000 guaranteed purse just to step into the ring. In 1913, $30,000 was an astronomical, completely absurd sum of money, equivalent to nearly $1 million today. The European promoters looked at the demand and immediately pulled their backing. The fight collapsed. Johnson successfully priced himself out of the market, effectively using capitalist leverage to execute a cowardly retreat. For Sam Langford, the Paris extortion was the final brutal realization of how the system worked. He had spent his entire life fighting the white establishment, battling corrupt promoters, biased referees, and rigged contracts. But the ultimate betrayal did not come from the white men smoking cigars at ringside. It came from a man who shared his exact background. It came from a man who knew the precise horrors of the poverty they both escaped. Jack Johnson reached the absolute peak of the mountain, looked down at the man who helped him get there, and kicked the ladder away. Langford realized the hardest truth of his profession: loyalty, shared suffering, and merit meant absolutely nothing in the face of asset protection. He was locked out of the World Championship permanently, and the men pulling the strings were about to build a brand new cage just for him. With Jack Johnson holding the world heavyweight title hostage behind the color line, the white boxing establishment faced a lucrative logistical problem. They had a roster of elite black contenders: Sam Langford, Joe Jeanette, Sam McVeigh, and later Harry Wills, who were mechanically superior to every white challenger on the market. If these men were allowed to fight white contenders, they would easily dismantle the great white hopes the public was paying massive premiums to see. The syndicates needed to protect the racial mythology that drove their primary revenue stream, but they also recognized the immense physical capital trapped in the black fighting circuit. Their solution was an act of brutal, calculated market segregation. They created a secondary economy. They invented the World-Colored Heavyweight Championship. The title was a complete fabrication. It was not recognized by the official boxing commissions. It carried no institutional authority. It was simply a marketing term printed on fight posters to mask the reality of what the promoters had actually built: a closed-loop meat grinder. The Syndicate took the 4 most dangerous fighters on the planet and locked them inside a financial cage. The rules of engagement were entirely dictated by the men controlling the gate receipts. Because these fighters were banned from the mainstream championship circuit, their earning potential was artificially capped. They could not command the massive life-changing purses awarded to white heavyweights. To survive, they had to rely on volume. They were forced to fight constantly, and they were forced to fight each other. The resulting schedule was a machine designed for human destruction. In a normal athletic career, a fighter might face his toughest rival 2, perhaps 3 times over a decade. The syndicates forced Sam Langford to fight Joe Jeanette 14 times. He was contracted to fight Sam McVeigh 15 times. He would eventually be thrown into the ring against the giant Harry Wills a staggering 22 times. These were not tactical defensive exhibitions. They were highly localized wars of attrition. When 2 men fight each other over a dozen times, the element of surprise vanishes. The fighters map every twitch, every foot placement, and every defensive flaw of their opponent. The matches cease to be sporting events and devolve into pure, unadulterated endurance tests. The objective shifts from outboxing the opponent to simply outlasting his capacity to absorb structural damage. The 15-fight series between Langford and Sam McVeigh stands as one of the most grueling physical extractions in the history of the sport. McVeigh was a massive 210-pound powerhouse. He was 50 pounds heavier than Langford. The promoters shipped them across the globe, booking them repeatedly in Australia and Europe to exploit untapped gambling markets. The syndicates demanded 20-round distances. Under the scorching heat of the Sydney Stadium lights, Langford and McVeigh battered each other for hours. The physical toll of repeatedly absorbing blows from a 210-pound man was catastrophic. Bones in Langford's hands shattered against McVeigh's skull. Scar tissue over his eyes split. Open in the exact same places, fight after fight. The promoters did not provide medical recovery periods. If the fight went the distance, they immediately drafted a contract for the rematch. If the men bled, the crowd bet more heavily. The financial mechanics of these closed-loop fights were rigidly controlled. The promoters and casino bosses handled the math. A stadium holding 15,000 people generated massive gate revenue. The trackside betting pools handled hundreds of thousands of dollars in illicit cash. But the fighters inside the ring operated on flat guarantees or severely depressed percentages. A promoter would collect $50,000 at the door, pay Langford and his opponent a few $100s each, and pocket the difference. After management cuts, travel expenses, and sparring partner fees were deducted, the fighters were practically broke within weeks of a 20-round war. The Syndicate engineered this poverty intentionally. A broke fighter is a compliant fighter. When Langford ran out of money, the promoters were always waiting with another contract, ready to feed him back into the cage against the exact same men who had just fractured his ribs a month prior. The cycle accelerated into absolute brutality with the arrival of Harry Wills. Wills was the new generation of the colored heavyweight circuit. He was a colossal, ruthless operator, standing 6'2" and weighing over 210 pounds. He possessed devastating speed and a vicious inside fighting game. When the Syndicates first matched Langford against Wills in 1914, Langford was 28 years old. In the chronological timeline of a normal man, 28 is the physical prime. But Langford had been fighting professionally for 12 years. He had over 100 recorded fights and dozens of unrecorded, unsanctioned brawls. His body was a map of improperly healed fractures, degraded cartilage, and accumulating neurological trauma. His physical degradation was entirely irrelevant, NT to the men managing the ledger. Where a physician would see an aging, structurally compromised body, the establishment simply saw an algorithmic opportunity to move the betting lines against a massive young contender. The 22 fights between Langford and Wills were a slow, methodical dismantling of a human body. Wills used his massive size advantage to lean on Langford, grinding his weight down on the older man's neck and shoulders for 15 rounds at a time. The physical math was unavoidable. Langford could still generate massive concussive force, and he knocked Wills out twice during their violent series. But the aggregate damage was entirely one-sided. Every time they fought, Wills extracted a permanent piece of Langford's health. Ribs cracked under heavy body shots. Brain tissue bruised against the inside of the skull. The cartilage in Langford's joints ground down to nothing. Ringside, the contrast was sickening. The arenas were filled with cigar smoke, tailored suits, and the constant mechanical counting of cash. The mobsters, the bookmakers, and the athletic commissioners sat in the front rows, heavily invested in the destruction occurring a few feet away. They watched blood spray across the canvas and simply calculated how it affected the odds for the next round. They viewed the men in the ring not as athletes, but as industrial machinery. A piece of heavy equipment is run continuously until the gears strip out and the engine seizes. The Syndicates applied the exact same principle to Sam Langford. They kept booking the fights. They kept dropping the 210-pound heavyweights on top of his 165-pound frame. They kept deducting their percentages. They were deliberately running the machine into the ground, waiting for the inevitable moment when the most crucial component of a fighter's anatomy would finally, violently snap. The human body is not engineered to absorb the kinetic impact of professional heavyweights for 15 years. Muscles can heal and bow. Nes can calcify, but the structural integrity of the human eye is entirely fragile. The retina is a thin layer of tissue attached to the back of the eyeball. When a fighter takes repeated blunt force trauma to the skull, the concussive shock waves pass directly through the orbital bones and into the fluid of the eye. Over hundreds of fights, the connective tissues weaken. The promoters who controlled Sam Langford's schedule understood the physical decline of their asset. By 1917, Langford was 31 years old. In the brutal mathematics of early 20th century boxing, he was functionally obsolete. His reaction times were slowing. His joints were deteriorating. But his name still carried massive brand recognition, and he still possessed the mechanical leverage to deliver a knockout punch. The Syndicate decided to squeeze the final drops of profit out of his failing body. They matched him against Fred Fulton. Fred Fulton, known as the Rochester Plasterer, was a massive white heavyweight contender. He stood 6'6" and weighed 215 pounds. He possessed a vicious left jab and a ruthless inside game. The fight took place on June 19, 1917 in Boston. The promoters booked the bout knowing full well that Langford was severely compromised, fighting with existing visual impairments and accumulating neurological damage. In the 7th round, the physics of a 50-pound weight disadvantage finally reached a catastrophic conclusion. Fulton delivered a heavy driving strike directly into Langford's left eye. The sheer force of the impact ruptured the weakened tissue. The retina tore away from the back of the eye. The fluid clouded with blood. In a fraction of a second, total darkness swallowed the left side of Langford's visual field. Standard medical protocol requires immediate surgical intervention for a detached retina. In a properly regulated athletic environment, the ringside physician would have stopped the bout instantly, and the state commission would have revoked a fighter's license permanently to prevent total blindness. But the Boston Athletic Commission in 1917 was not a regulatory body. It was an extension of the gambling syndicate. The ringside doctors were paid by the promoters. When Langford returned to his corner, bleeding and stating he could not see out of his left eye, his management did not throw in the towel. They wiped the blood off his face, applied ice to the swelling, and pushed him back into the ring. They forced a half-blind man to finish the fight. Langford survived until the final bell, losing the decision. But the loss on the record was irrelevant. The true outcome was permanent physical mutilation. The aftermath of the Fulton fight exposed the absolute criminality of the boxing establishment. The injury was not a secret. The managers knew Langford was blind in the left eye. The local athletic commissions knew it. The syndicate bookmakers knew it. If they stopped booking him, the revenue stream generated by the Sam Langford brand would evaporate. The solution was systematic medical fraud. Promoters paid off state-appointed doctors to falsify Langford's pre-fight medical clearances. Physicians signed official government documents swearing that Langford possessed adequate vision to compete in a professional combat sport. They rubber-stamped a severe medical disability because rejecting him would mean losing their lucrative positions within the athletic club hierarchy. Langford could not simply walk away. The syndicate had deliberately engineered his financial ruin to prevent his retirement. Throughout his career, managers had taken exorbitant percentages of his purses and charged him phantom expenses for training camps, sparring partners, and travel. To survive between fights, Langford had been forced to take cash advances from his management. By 1917, He was drowning in debt to the exact same men who booked his fights. He had zero capital to pay for specialized optical surgery. He had zero savings to Seki or housing. The promoters weaponized his poverty. They presented him with a cold ultimatum: step back into the ring half-blind or starve on the street. The Syndicate treated his severed retina not as a medical emergency, but as an operational inconvenience that required him to fight more frequently to pay off his mounting debts. The medical reality of severe eye trauma is progressive. When one eye is destroyed, the healthy eye takes on the entire burden of depth perception and light processing. This causes extreme ocular stress. Furthermore, opposing fighters in their corners immediately recognized Langford's vulnerability. They brutally targeted his blind side. They threw sweeping hooks from his left, exploiting the dead zone in his vision. Langford absorbed massive, undefended strikes to the left side of his head because he simply could not see the gloves coming. This secondary trauma accelerated the deterioration of his right eye. The remaining eye began to develop dense cataracts and severe structural scarring. His world shrunk from a clear picture to a blurry gray fog. To survive the cage, Langford engineered a horrific physiological adaptation. He realized he could no longer rely on visual data to track heavyweights trying to take his head off. He had to fight using alternative sensory inputs. Before the opening bell, the referee would call the fighters to the center of the ring for instructions. For the crowd, touching gloves was a standard display of sportsmanship. For Langford, it was a crucial radar calibration. When his gloves met his opponents, he measured the exact distance of the man's torso. He memorized the precise length of the enemy's arms. Once the fight began, Langford retreated to the ropes. He used the physical tension of the hemp ropes against his back to orient himself in the square space of the ring, ensuring he would not be flanked. He closed his failing eyes. He listened intensely to the friction of leather boxing boots sliding across a canvas to determine the angle of attack. He tracked the respiratory rate of his opponent, listening for the sharp intake of breath that signaled an incoming punch. He became a living ghost, navigating the violent space of the ring entirely by sound, touch, and kinetic memory. The public remained completely ignorant of this nightmare. The promoters marketed the fights as standard heavyweight bouts. The crowds packed the arenas, drinking, smoking, and betting heavily on the action. They cheered as Langford traded heavy blows with younger, massive contenders. They thought they were watching a seasoned veteran utilizing a defensive, flat-footed style. They did not realize they were watching an act of sanctioned medical torture. The men in the tailored suits, sitting trackside, watched a legally disabled man rely on his hearing to avoid lethal brain damage, and their only concern was whether he would beat the spread. The extraction machine had reached its most depraved phase. The Syndicate had officially stripped away his vision, and they were preparing to squeeze whatever life was left in his nervous system before dumping him into the dark completely. By 1922, the biological clock on Sam Langford's remaining vision ran out completely. The right eye, which had carried the entire burden of his sight since the retinal detachment in 1917, collapsed under the cumulative trauma. Dense cataracts formed over the lens. The orbital socket had absorbed hundreds of undefended strikes from heavyweights who specifically targeted his blind side. The optic nerve degraded. The hazy gray fog that Langford had relied upon to navigate the ring darkened, and then it turned completely black. Sam Langford was 36 years old. He had fought over 250 professional bouts. He was now 100% legally and functionally blind. In a rational, regulated industry, total blindness is an absolute non-negotiable termination of employment. In the boxing economy of the 1920s, it was simply a logistical hurdle. Total blindness was a known operational variable. The fact that Langford could no longer see was an open secret shared between his handlers, the promoters, and the state athletic commissions, the very bodies legally mandated to protect him. Yet the brand still commanded gate revenue, overriding any medical or moral baseline. The Syndicate possessed a highly recognizable asset that could still be thrown to younger, rising contenders to build their records. They refused to retire him. Instead, they escalated the medical fraud to an unprecedented level of criminality. Getting a completely blind man licensed to fight required systematic corruption. When state-appointed physicians conducted pre-fight medical examinations, they engaged in a synchronized charade. They hung the standard optical charts on the wall. Langford's handlers read the letters to him in the locker room beforehand. When the doctor asked Langford to read the chart, he simply recited the memorized sequence. The doctors signed the official state documents, legally verifying that a man who could not see his own hands had the visual acuity to dodge punches from professional killers. The promoters paid the necessary bribes, secured the licenses, and continued booking the fights. On June 5, 1922, this system of exploitation culminated in Atlanta, Georgia. The Syndicate matched the 36-year-old totally blind Langford against a 26-year-old rising star named Tiger Flowers. Flowers was a lethal, hyper-athletic southpaw who would go on to win the World Middleweight Championship. He possessed devastating hand speed and a relentless offensive output. Throwing a blind man into a square ring with a prime Tiger Flowers was not a sporting contest. It was an orchestrated physical sacrifice designed to build Flowers' resume and enrich the local bookmakers. When Langford walked out of the dressing room, his handlers had to physically guide him down the aisle. They navigated him up the stairs, held the ropes open, and aimed him toward his corner. The crowd in Atlanta roared, entirely ignorant of the fact that the legendary fighter standing in front of them could not see the arena lights. When the opening bell rang, Langford's handlers stepped down, leaving a blind man alone in a 20-foot cage with an apex predator. Langford's survival protocol kicked in. He touched gloves with Flowers, using that split-second contact to measure the younger man's height, shoulder width, and reach. Then Langford retreated. He backed up until he felt the heavy hemp ropes press against his spine. The ropes provided his spatial coordinates. He knew if his back was on the ropes, Flowers could only attack from a 180-degree frontal arc. But Langford faced a lethal geometric problem. He could not see the punches coming, which meant he could not block them. If he tried to fight defensively, Flowers' speed would eventually overwhelm his guard, resulting in severe brain damage or death. Langford realized his only chance of survival was to dictate exactly where and how Flowers attacked. He had to set a trap. Langford intentionally dropped his guard. He lowered his massive arms, deliberately exposing his left rib cage. It was a highly calculated biomechanical bait. He knew that any professional fighter seeing an open rib cage would immediately step in and throw a right hook to the body. Langford did not need to see Flowers. He just needed to know exactly where Flowers' head would be when he threw that specific punch. In the second round, Flowers took the bait. The younger fighter saw the opening and lunged forward to break Langford's ribs. Langford could not see the movement, but his deadened nervous system and heightened senses detected the shift in the environment. He felt the displacement of air pressure. He heard the sharp friction of Flowers' boots driving into the canvas. He He listened to the sudden intake of breath required to throw a power punch. So Powers stepped into the pocket. Langford did not block. He pivoted his dense barrel-shaped torso, planted his feet, and threw a massive sweeping right hook into the absolute darkness. He put the entire rotational force of his 74-inch wingspan behind the strike. The punch was aimed blindly at the exact spatial coordinate where Flowers' head was mathematically required to be. The impact was catastrophic. Langford's fist collided perfectly with Flowers' jaw. The kinetic force short-circuited the younger man's nervous system instantly. Tiger Flowers, the future middleweight champion of the world, collapsed to the canvas, completely unconscious. The referee counted him out. The crowd erupted, believing they had just witnessed a brilliant tactical counterpunch by a seasoned veteran. They had no idea they had just watched a desperate blind man successfully guess the trajectory of a lethal attack to save his own life. The knockout of Tiger Flowers was a localized miracle, but it triggered a massive panic within the boxing establishment. The Syndicate bosses and the athletic commissioners looked at the result and realized they had lost control of the variables. Langford was not supposed to win. The Atlanta fight exposed a terrifying legal liability. Langford was fighting entirely on sensory guesswork. If his calculations were off by an inch, he would take undefended concussive blows directly to the skull. If Sam Langford died of a brain hemorrhage in the middle of a sanctioned bout, the resulting homicide investigation would expose the falsified medical records. It would expose the corrupted doctors. It would expose the illegal gambling networks. The federal government would intervene, and the lucrative boxing economy would be shut down. The Syndicate did not care about Langford's health. They cared about protecting their revenue streams. By 1923, the major athletic commissions across the United States quietly issued a unified, unwritten directive. They revoked Sam Langford's boxing license. They banned him from competing in any regulated jurisdiction in the country. The establishment that had extracted his physical prime ignored his detached retina and forced him to fight through total blindness, suddenly discovered its regulatory authority the moment he became a legal liability to their casino operations. But the ban did not come with a pension. It did not come with severance pay or a medical trust fund. Langford was 37 years old, completely blind, and deeply in debt to his former managers. Stripped of his license, he had absolutely zero means of generating income in the United States. To avoid starvation, he was forced to seek employment in unregulated, highly dangerous markets outside the jurisdiction of the American commissions. The remaining promoters who still held his paper trafficked him south. They smuggled a blind man across the border into the Mexican boxing circuit. The fighting conditions in Mexico in the mid-1920s were primitive. There were no state commissions. There were no doctors. The rings were often pitched in dirt lots behind cantinas, surrounded by heavy betting pools. Langford was matched against local heavyweights who mercilessly exploited his blindness. He absorbed horrific, unregulated beatings. He fought in the sweltering heat, unable to see his opponents, taking severe trauma to the head and body, simply to earn enough cash to pay for his food and a train ticket back to New York. This brutal exile lasted for 3 years. He fought in Mexico. He fought in unregulated underground bouts in Canada. And he took whatever unsanctioned fights he could find. His body, once an indestructible machine forged in the logging camps, finally began to disintegrate. The joints locked up. The neurological damage slowed his reflexes to a crawl. The raw punching power that had defined his existence evaporated. He could no longer throw the blind hooks that saved his life in Atlanta. By 1926, Langford hit the absolute bottom of his physical utility. He was 40 years old and entirely broken. He fought his final recorded bout, a pathetic, slow-motion beating where he could barely defend himself. The men who controlled his contracts looked at the ruined asset. The math was final. The machine could no longer generate a single dollar of profit. The promoters tore up his paperwork. They completely severed their ties. They did not buy him a house. They did not pay for a caretaker. They took the millions of dollars generated by his blood over a 24-year, 300-fight career, and they kept it. Sam Langford was driven back to New York City and literally left on the street. The extraction was complete. The system had consumed his youth, his health, and his eyes, and now it threw the empty shell into the dark. The physical abandonment of Sam Langford in 1926 was not an accident. It was a calculated corporate procedure. When a piece of industrial machinery breaks down beyond repair, the factory owner does not pay for its upkeep. The machine is unbolted from the floor, pushed out the back door, and left to rust. The boxing syndicates applied this exact operational logic to human beings. There were no severance packages in the 1920s fight game. There were no pensions. There were no medical trusts. The men who controlled Langford simply stopped booking him. They stopped answering questions about him. They erased him from their ledgers. The contracts were voided by absolute silence. The syndicate bosses took the millions of dollars generated by Langford's blood and invested it into real estate, casinos, and legitimate businesses. They bought mansions in New York and Chicago. They transitioned from underground racketeers into respected members of high society. Meanwhile, the asset that built their wealth was deposited into the slums of Harlem. Langford was 40 years old, entirely blind, and suffering from advanced neurological and structural degradation. His joints were calcified from absorbing thousands of rounds of heavy impact. His hands, the very instruments that generated the syndicate's fortune, were a mass of improperly healed fractures and severe arthritis. Langford's daily reality in Harlem was a masterclass in severe sensory deprivation and extreme poverty. He inhabited a crumbling, unheated tenement room. The Great Depression would soon devastate the American economy, but for Langford, the economic collapse had already occurred. He existed on an income of roughly 20 cents a day, cobbled together from the charity of local neighborhood residents who recognized him. His existence was confined to a chair in the dark. He could not see the walls around him. He could not read. He could not work. The physical world was reduced to the immediate space he could touch, but this is where the standard narrative of victimization fails. The system expected Langford to die quickly. A rapid death in the slums would have been highly convenient for the boxing establishment. It would tie up a loose end and erase a walking liability. Langford refused to provide them with that convenience. He did not drink himself to death. He did not lose his mind. He constructed an impenetrable psychological fortress. He had spent his entire life absorbing catastrophic physical punishment, and he simply transferred that pain tolerance to his economic reality. He acquired a cheap guitar. He sat in the dark, taught himself to play by touch, and listened to the sounds of the street. He adapted to absolute poverty with the same cold, mechanical survival instinct he had used to navigate the boxing ring when his eyes first began to fail. For nearly 2 decades, the sports media and the boxing establishment engaged in a collective, deliberate amnesia. The press, which had built their circulation numbers writing about his brutal fights, completely ignored his existence. The athletic commissions, who had rubber-stamped his falsified medical records, pretended he had never been licensed. A highly profitable myth was circulated within the industry that Langford was dead. Promoters told reporters that he had passed away years ago, effectively shutting down any inquiries. It was an active erasure. The industry buried him alive to protect their own public relations. They did not want the ticket-buying public to see the physical consequences of the product they were purchasing. This corporate cover-up remained intact until January 1944. Al Laney, an investigative sports reporter for the New York Herald Tribune, decided to audit the establishment's narrative. Laney was researching an article on the greatest fighters of the early 20th century. He needed to track down Sam Langford. When Laney asked the current generation of boxing promoters and managers in New York where Langford was buried, the answers were evasive. The establishment men claimed they did not know the details. They told Laney to drop the story. The resistance Laney encountered triggered a journalistic instinct. He realized he was not looking for a grave. He was looking at a cover-up. Laney bypassed the official channels. He left the polished offices of Madison Square Garden and walked into Harlem. He began running a ground-level investigation. He asked police officers, bartenders, and shop owners. For days, he hit dead ends. The city had completely swallowed the former contender. Finally, a local resident pointed him toward a decaying tenement building on 139th Street. When Laney entered the building, he found a hallway that smelled of rot and neglect. He knocked on a door at the end of the hall. He walked into a tiny windowless room. The environment was freezing. There was no light. In the corner of the room, sitting on the edge of a bare mattress, was Sam Langford. He was 58 years old. His clothes were threadbare. He was completely blind, isolated, and living on the absolute precipice of starvation. Laney expected to find a broken, bitter man. He expected to hear a tragic monologue about betrayal, stolen money, and the cruelty of the syndicates. He expected the standard psychology of a victim. Instead, Laney encountered something terrifying to the establishment. He encountered absolute, unbreakable pride. Langford recognized Laney was a reporter. He sat up straight. He did not ask for money. He did not ask for pity. When Laney asked him about his condition, the blind man smiled, let out a deep laugh, and delivered a statement that completely dismantled the narrative of his own destruction. Langford told the reporter, "Don't feel sorry for old Sam. I had a good run." That sentence was not a display of touching humility. It was an act of extreme psychological defiance. It was the absolute pride of an uncrowned king. Langford refused to give the men who stole his money, in his eyes, the satisfaction of breaking his mind. He knew exactly what he had done in the ring. He knew he had terrified the heavyweight champions of the world. He knew he was mechanically superior to the men the establishment crowned as kings. By stating he had a good run, Langford took ownership of his own history. He denied the Syndicate the power to define his legacy as a tragedy. He was a survivor of the ultimate meat grinder, and he was still breathing in the dark. Laney published the article in the Herald Tribune. He did not use flowery language. He did not write a melodramatic sob story. He laid out the cold, raw facts. He detailed the exact living conditions. He named the era. He exposed the fact that one of the greatest athletes in American history was starving to death in a lightless room while the boxing industry generated millions of dollars just a few miles away. The article hit the American public like a blunt instrument. The raw reality of Langford's existence shattered the polished mythology of the sports world. Readers were outraged. A massive public response generated a wave of donations. Laney organized a trust fund. Enough money was collected to ensure Langford, R.D., would never starve again. The fund paid for his rent, his food, and eventually moved him out of the tenement. But the creation of this trust fund must be analyzed clinically. It was framed by the media as a triumph of human charity. It was actually a glaring indictment of systemic failure. Charity is what happens when justice breaks down. The money that saved Sam Langford in 1944 did not come from the promoters who stole his purses. It did not come from the casino bosses who profited off his blood. It did not come from the athletic commissions that forced a blind man to fight. It came from the working class public. The average citizen reached into their pockets to pay the debt that the capitalist machinery owed to Sam Langford. The syndicate bosses kept their fortunes entirely intact. They bought their absolution for absolutely nothing. The trust fund provided Langford with physical security for the final decade of his life. He was eventually moved into a private nursing home in Cambridge, Massachusetts. The facility provided heat, 3 meals a day, and medical supervision. For the first time since he was a child in Weymouth Falls, Langford did not have to worry about extreme physical violence or starvation, but his body continued to fail. The accumulated trauma of over 300 professional fights accelerated his neurological decline. He spent his final years confined to a bed, lost in the dark, his massive chest still rising and falling until his heart finally gave out. Sam Langford died on January 12, 1956. He was 69 years old. Following his death, the boxing establishment immediately attempted to sanitize his history. The same organizations that enforced the color line, sanctioned his blind fights, and abandoned him to the slums suddenly embraced him. They wrote glowing obituaries. They praised his courage. Decades later, they inducted him into the International Boxing Hall of Fame. They cast his name in bronze and placed it in a museum. This post-mortem glorification is the final ultimate insult. It is the system laundering its own crimes. A bronze plaque does not retroactively rewrite the contracts. A Hall of Fame induction does not reattach a severed retina. The establishment honors dead fighters because dead men cannot demand an audit. They cannot sue for back wages. They cannot point a finger at the men who destroyed them. By crowning Langford a legend after he was safely in the ground, the industry successfully masked a crime scene as a sports history exhibit. The true legacy of Sam Langford cannot be found on a bronze plaque. It is found in the cold, hard mechanics of the industry that consumed him. He was the perfect physical anomaly, forged by child abuse and industrial labor, weaponized by corrupt promoters, and fed into a closed-loop economy designed to extract his health for capital. He was forced to fight under a system of racial and economic apartheid. He fought until his eyes failed, and then he fought in the dark. The story of Sam Langford is not a sports story. It is an autopsy of early casino capitalism. It is the definitive proof that the athletic establishment was never designed to protect the athlete. It was designed to manufacture gods, extract their blood, convert their physical destruction into untraceable cash, and discard the empty shell on the street. Sam Langford survived it all. He kept his pride. He took their best shots and never blinked. But the system never loses. The house always keeps the money.